The irony wasn't lost on me that the book I was signing was titled Resilience. 200 people packed into the Beacon Community Center on Main Street, and there he was in the back row, looking exactly the same as the day he walked out of our apartment while I was still hooked to N4 drip. Michael Thompson, the man who promised to love me in sickness and in health, then redefined both terms when my multiple sclerosis diagnosis arrived like an unwelcome wedding guest. My name is Emma Sullivan. I'm 34 years old, and 2 years ago, I was a different person entirely. Back then, I was an ambitious marketing director at a Hudson Valley tech startup called Innovate Tech, engaged to a successful orthopedic surgeon at New York Presbyterian, planning a life that looked perfect from the outside. We had the historic Colonial on Fishkill Avenue with the wraparound porch and original hardwood floors, the weekend cabin in the Catskills overlooking a pristine lake, the 5-year plan that included children and career milestones mapped out like a business strategy. Then my left hand started going numb during client presentations. At first, I dismissed it. Stress, maybe. Too many late nights hunched over my laptop, crafting marketing campaigns for clients who demanded miracles on impossible timelines. I was used to pushing through discomfort. It was practically a requirement in my field. But when the numbness spread to my arm during a particularly important pitch to a potential client in White Plains, I knew something was wrong. Michael noticed it too. He watched me fumble with my coffee cup one morning at our kitchen island, the one we'd carefully selected from a showroom in Cold Spring. His surgeon's eyes missed nothing. Not the way I had to concentrate to grip the handle, not the slight tremor in my fingers that I thought I'd been hiding. "You should see someone," he said, not looking up from his medical journal. "It's probably just stress." "Emma." His voice carried that particular tone he used when he thought he knew better, which was often. "You're losing sensation in your dominant hand. That's not stress." The first doctor I saw in Poughkeepsie dismissed my concerns with the kind of casual misogyny I'd grown accustomed to in professional settings. "Probably carpal tunnel," he said. "Take some ibuprofen and use a wrist brace." But Michael insisted I see a neurologist, and his connections in the medical community meant I got an appointment that would have taken most people months to secure. Dr. Patricia Williams at St. Francis Hospital was different. She listened when I described the numbness, the fatigue that seemed to come from nowhere, the brief episodes of double vision I'd convinced myself were just eye strain. She ordered an MRI, blood tests, a spinal tap that left me bedridden for 2 days. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday in October, one of those crisp autumn days when the Hudson Valley shows off its palette of reds and golds. Multiple sclerosis, relapsing remitting type. The neurologist's words floated around the sterile office like dust particles in afternoon sunlight. Michael sat beside me, his surgeon's hands folded in his lap, his face wearing the same expression he probably used when delivering bad news to patients' families. Dr. Williams explained it all with the kind of thoroughness I appreciated in my professional life, but found overwhelming in this context. The immune system attacking the nervous system, the unpredictable nature of relapses, the medications that might slow progression, the lifestyle changes that would become necessary, the uncertainty that would now color every plan, every hope, every assumption about the future. "What's the prognosis?" Michael asked, and I could hear the surgeon in his voice, clinical, detached, already problem-solving. "It varies greatly from patient to patient," Dr. Williams replied. "Some people live full, active lives with minimal symptoms. Others experience more significant disability over time. We'll know more about Emma's particular case as we see how she responds to treatment." That night, he held me while I cried. He said all the right words about fighting this together, about adapting, about love being stronger than any diagnosis. For 6 weeks, he played the part of the devoted fiancé beautifully. He drove me to appointments in White Plains and Poughkeepsie, researched treatments online, even bought a pill organizer with days of the week printed in bold letters, and helped me set up a medication schedule. But I could feel him pulling away like a tide retreating from the Hudson River. It started with small things that I told myself I was imagining. He stopped reaching for my hand during our evening walks through Memorial Park. He found reasons to work late at the hospital, taking on extra surgeries and volunteering for committees he'd previously avoided. When friends asked about our wedding plans, he deflected with vague mentions of wanting to get Emma's health situation stabilized first. The physical symptoms were manageable with the medication Dr. Williams prescribed. The emotional toll of watching my fiancé slowly distance himself was not. I found myself walking on eggshells, trying to appear as normal and healthy as possible, as if I could somehow convince him, and maybe myself, that nothing had really changed. When I had my first major relapse 3 months after diagnosis, the illusion became impossible to maintain. It started on a Thursday morning in January. I woke up with double vision so severe I couldn't read the clock beside our bed. By afternoon, the fatigue had settled into my bones like concrete, and my legs felt disconnected from my brain. Michael found me on the bathroom floor that evening, unable to stand after a shower, wrapped in a towel and crying from frustration more than fear. The emergency room at St. Francis became my temporary home for the next 5 days. For steroids, around-the-clock monitoring, a parade of doctors and nurses who spoke about me in the third person while I lay there feeling like a specimen under examination. Michael visited dutifully, bringing flowers and magazines I was too exhausted to read, but he looked at me lying in that hospital bed like I had become a stranger. The conversation that ended everything happened on a Sunday morning in December, almost a year after my diagnosis. Snow was falling outside our bedroom window, covering the bare branches of the oak trees that lined Fishkill Avenue. The kind of peaceful scene that should have felt romantic, especially with Christmas approaching. Instead, it felt like a funeral. Michael sat on the edge of the bed, still in his running clothes from his morning jog through Memorial Park. He'd maintained his exercise routine religiously throughout my illness, as if physical fitness could somehow protect him from the unpredictability that had invaded our lives. His hair was damp with sweat and melting snowflakes, and he stared at his hands with the intensity of someone trying to solve an impossible equation. "I can't do this, Emma," he said finally. "I'm not strong enough to watch you get worse." The words came out clinical, measured, like he was discussing a patient's prognosis rather than ending our 4-year relationship. No anger would have been easier to process. This quiet defeat, this admission that I had become too much work, too much uncertainty, too much reality in his carefully controlled world, that cut deeper than any physical symptom ever could. "I thought I could handle it," he continued, still not looking at me. "When you were first diagnosed, I thought we'd figure it out together. But watching you in the hospital, seeing you struggle with things that used to be so easy for you, I realized I'm not the person I thought I was." I sat there in our bed, the bed we'd picked out together at a furniture store in Newburgh, the bed where we'd planned our future and talked about baby names and argued about whether to get a dog, and felt something inside me go very still. "What are you saying, Michael?" "I'm saying I can't be what you need. I can't be the husband who helps you navigate this disease, who adapts to all the changes that are coming. I thought I could, but I can't." He finally looked at me then, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Fear. Not of the disease itself, but of what loving someone with a chronic illness might cost him. Of the sacrifices he might have to make, the life he might have to give up, the uncertainty he'd have to learn to live with. "I'm leaving," he said. "I think it's better for both of us." The conversation lasted another 20 minutes, but those were the only words that mattered. He talked about logistics, who would stay in the house, how we'd divide our things, when he'd come back to pack. I listened with the same detached attention I'd once brought to client meetings, nodding at appropriate moments, asking clarifying questions about practical matters while the emotional reality remained carefully compartmentalized. He moved out that afternoon while I sat in the living room, watching him pack his things with the efficiency of someone who had already mentally left weeks ago. He folded clothes with surgical precision, wrapped picture frames in newspaper, sorted through books and CDs like he was conducting an inventory. The engagement ring, a classic solitaire he'd chosen without consulting me, assuming he knew my taste, I removed myself and placed it on the kitchen counter next to his house keys. "Emma," he said as he loaded the last box into his BMW, "I want you to know this isn't about you. You're still the same person I fell in love with." But that wasn't true, and we both knew it. I wasn't the same person anymore, and neither was he. The disease had revealed something about both of us, my capacity for resilience I hadn't known I possessed, and his inability to love someone whose future couldn't be guaranteed. The months that followed were the hardest of my life, and not because of the MS. The disease I could manage with medication, physical therapy at Hudson Valley Physical Medicine, and lifestyle changes that gradually became second nature. Dr. Williams had connected me with other patients, and I discovered a community of people who understood the peculiar challenges of living with an invisible chronic illness. The loneliness, the betrayal, the complete reconstruction of my identity that required a different kind of treatment. I quit my job at Innovate Tech, not because I couldn't do it anymore, but because I realized I had been performing a version of myself that didn't exist anymore. The woman who defined herself by her productivity, her achievements, her ability to keep pace with everyone else in conference rooms and client meetings, she had died in that sterile doctor's office. And trying to resurrect her felt like wearing clothes that no longer fit. My boss, a kind woman named Sarah Chin, didn't try to talk me out of it when I submitted my resignation. She'd watched me struggle through my relapses, seen me push myself to maintain impossible standards while dealing with symptoms that left me exhausted and foggy-brained. "What will you do?" she asked during my exit interview. "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but I need to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to prove I'm not sick." Instead of looking for another corporate job, I started writing. I had always kept a journal, a habit left over from college creative writing classes, but now the words poured out like water from a broken dam. I wrote about the diagnosis, about Michael's departure, about the strange freedom that comes with losing everything you thought defined you. I wrote about the guilt of grieving a relationship while simultaneously dealing with a chronic illness, the way people's discomfort with both situations often left me feeling doubly isolated. I wrote about the well-meaning friends who disappeared when I could no longer keep up with their pace of life, the ones who stopped inviting me to events because they assumed I wouldn't feel up to it. I wrote about the new friends I'd found in support groups and online forums, people who understood that chronic illness doesn't mean giving up on joy, just learning to find it in different places. But mostly, I wrote about discovering who I was when stripped of all the external markers I had used to measure my worth. The writing became a lifeline. I spent mornings at the Beacon Coffee House on Main Street, a cozy place with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls, watching the Hudson River flow past while pages turned into chapters. The owner, a woman named Maria Rodriguez, never made me feel guilty about nursing a single cup of coffee for hours while I filled notebook after notebook with my story. "You're writing a book," she observed one morning, refilling my cup without being asked. "Maybe," I said. "I'm not sure it's any good." "The good ones never are sure," she replied with a smile that reminded me why I'd chosen to make Beacon my home. I had moved out of the house on Fishkill Avenue, too many memories, too much space for one person, and found a small apartment on Teller Avenue with a view of the river. It was the first place I'd ever chosen entirely for myself, without considering anyone else's preferences or needs. The rent was manageable on my disability benefits and the small inheritance my grandmother had left me, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. Resilience. Finding strength in the unraveling wasn't just a memoir about living with MS. It was about the unexpected gifts that come with having your life completely dismantled and rebuilt from scratch. I wrote about the relationships that couldn't survive my illness and the ones that deepened because of it. I wrote about learning to distinguish between help and pity, between accommodation and limitation. The book found its way to an agent through a writing contest I'd entered on a whim. Lisa Martinez, a sharp woman with an office in Manhattan, called me on a Tuesday morning while I was having coffee with my friend Jessica Rodriguez, Maria's daughter who had become one of my closest confidants. "I stayed up all night reading your manuscript," Lisa said. "I haven't done that in years. When can you come to the city to discuss representation?" The publishing process moved faster than I'd expected. Within 6 months, I had a contract with a respected imprint known for publishing meaningful memoirs. The editor, David Kim, understood what I was trying to accomplish, not just telling my story, but illuminating something universal about resilience, about the difference between surviving and thriving. Suddenly, I was doing something I never could have imagined in my previous life, speaking to audiences about vulnerability, about redefining strength, about finding meaning in uncertainty. The book tour started small, local bookstores, community centers, libraries, but word spread. Readers connected with the honest portrayal of chronic illness, the complex emotions around relationship loss, the journey towards self-acceptance. Which brought me to this moment, sitting at a signing table in the Beacon Community Center where I'd attended countless town halls and art shows, watching Michael hover near the local history section like he was lost. He had aged in the 2 years since I'd seen him. Gray threads ran through his dark hair, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He wore a navy suit that I recognized, the one he'd worn to his colleague's wedding at the Culinary Institute in Hyde Park, where he'd introduced me as his future wife to people who would never see me again. The signing had started at 7 o'clock. I'd arrived early to set up, chatting with volunteers who'd known me since I'd moved to Beacon, people who'd watched my transformation from a broken woman struggling with a new diagnosis to someone who'd found purpose in her pain. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the community center, had insisted on putting out her good tablecloth and arranging flowers from her garden. The crowd was larger than I'd expected. Friends from my support group, neighbors from Teller Avenue, fellow writers from the Hudson Valley literary community, strangers who'd driven from as far as Albany and New York City after reading reviews of my book. I signed copies for a woman whose daughter had just been diagnosed with lupus, for a man whose wife had left him after his stroke, for a teenager whose mother was battling cancer. Each interaction reminded me why I'd written the book, not for fame or recognition, but to reach people who felt as lost and alone as I once had. I watched Michael from my peripheral vision throughout the evening, noting how he picked up pamphlets about upcoming events and put them down, how he checked his phone repeatedly, how he seemed to be working up the courage for something. He looked uncomfortable in the way people do when they're somewhere they don't quite belong, somewhere they have no right to be but can't seem to leave. When the last reader left with a signed copy, when the community center volunteers began cleaning up and stacking chairs, he finally approached. I was packing my things into the canvas bag I'd bought at a bookstore in Cold Spring, moving slowly because I'd learned not to rush transitions. They often triggered symptoms. Emma. My name in his voice still carried the familiar weight of shared history, but it felt different now, like hearing a song you once loved played in a different key. I looked up from my bag, taking in the man who had once been the center of my universe, and felt nothing but a distant curiosity, like observing an exhibit in a museum. Michael. He stood there holding a copy of my book, with my name on the cover and my story inside, and I could see him struggling with what to say. The confident surgeon who'd never lacked for words in our relationship seemed diminished somehow, uncertain. Part of me wanted to make it easier for him, to fall back into the old pattern of smoothing over uncomfortable moments, of managing his emotions as carefully as I'd once managed my symptoms. But I had learned something important in the past 2 years. Other people's discomfort was not my responsibility to fix. I read it, he said finally, holding up the book. I'm proud of you. The words hung in the air between us, and I wondered what he expected me to do with them. Thank him? Smile gratefully? Fall back into the role of the woman who'd once lived for his approval? Instead, I simply looked at him and waited. Silence, I'd learned, was a powerful tool. It forced people to fill the space with truth instead of pleasantries. You look good, he continued, and I could hear the surprise in his voice. Healthy. Happy. I am happy, I said, and meant it. Are you? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He shifted his weight, glanced around the nearly empty community center, then back at me. I made a mistake, he said, his voice dropping to the intimate tone he used to reserve for late-night conversations on our back porch, when we'd plan our future and dream about the life we'd build together. I was scared. I thought I was protecting myself, but I realized now I was just being a coward. There it was. The apology I had imagined receiving during countless sleepless nights 2 years ago, when the pain was fresh and I still believed that love meant fighting for someone no matter what. The acknowledgement of his failure, his weakness, his inability to love me through the hard parts. It should have felt victorious, validating, like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. Instead, it felt irrelevant. You were protecting yourself, I agreed, slinging my bag over my shoulder. And that's exactly what you should have done. He blinked, clearly not expecting this response. In our relationship, I'd been the one who apologized, who took responsibility for managing his feelings, who worked to fix things when they went wrong. This calm acceptance of his admission, without anger or hurt, seemed to confuse him more than any argument would have. I've spent 2 years thinking about what happened between us, I continued, standing up from the signing table. And I've realized that you did me a favor. You showed me who you really were when it mattered most. More importantly, you forced me to discover who I really was. He stepped closer, and I could smell his cologne, the same expensive scent he'd worn since medical school, the one that used to make me feel safe and desired. Now it just smelled like the past, like a person I used to be. I want to try again, he said, and there was something desperate in his voice that I'd never heard before. I'm different now. Stronger. I've been in therapy, working on myself. I understand things I didn't understand before. I smiled, and it wasn't bitter or sarcastic. It was genuine, perhaps the first truly honest expression I'd worn in his presence in years. I'm sure you're stronger, Michael. I'm sure therapy has helped you understand yourself better. But I'm not the same person you left. I'm not sick Emma who needs taking care of, and I'm not the woman who would have begged you to stay 2 years ago. I'm someone completely new, someone you never got the chance to meet. His face crumpled slightly, the composed surgeon's mask slipping to reveal something raw underneath. For just a moment, he looked like the young medical resident I'd fallen in love with, vulnerable and uncertain. So that's it? No second chances? Second chances are for people who made mistakes in good relationships, I said, walking toward the exit. What we had wasn't a good relationship, Michael. It was a performance, and when I couldn't keep up my part of the show, it fell apart. That's not love. That's business. He followed me to the door, and I could feel his desperation growing. Emma, please. I know I hurt you, but I loved you. I still love you. I stopped and turned back to face him, this man who had once been my whole world, who had shaped so many of my dreams and plans and assumptions about the future. You loved a version of me, I said gently. The version that was healthy and successful and fit into your idea of what your life should look like. When that version couldn't exist anymore, you left. That's not loving a person, Michael. That's loving an idea. But you're that person again, he said, gesturing toward the book in his hands. You're successful. You're thriving. You've written a bestseller. I'm successful on my own terms now, I replied. Not because I'm trying to prove I'm not sick, but because I've learned to build a life that accommodates who I really am. The difference is enormous. He stood there in the doorway of the community center, looking lost in a way that might have broken my heart 2 years ago. Now I just felt sad for him, sad that he'd never learned to love someone unconditionally, sad that he'd missed the chance to grow alongside someone who discovered profound strength and vulnerability. For what it's worth, I said, pushing open the door to the cool evening air, I forgive you. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It just means I'm no longer carrying around the weight of your choices. Outside, Main Street hummed with its usual evening energy. People heading to dinner at the Roundhouse, couples walking hand in hand toward the waterfront, teenagers hanging out in front of the vintage shop that had opened last year. Life continuing in all its messy, beautiful complexity, regardless of personal dramas. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing in the cool Hudson Valley air, and realized something profound had just happened. I had closed a chapter that had been left open for 2 years, not with anger or tears or dramatic declarations, but with clarity. The woman who had loved Michael Thompson, desperately, completely, at the expense of her own boundaries, she was gone. In her place stood someone who had learned the difference between being chosen and being settled for, between being loved and being tolerated. My phone buzzed with a text from my editor about tomorrow's radio interview on WKP. Another buzzed from Jessica asking how the signing went and if I wanted to grab coffee in the morning. A third from my mother in Boston, reminding me about lunch next weekend at Zephyr Restaurant when she came to visit. All these people who had entered my life during my rebuilding, who knew me as I was now rather than as I used to be. I didn't look back to see if Michael was still inside the community center. It didn't matter anymore. The walk home took me along Main Street, past the shops and restaurants that had become part of my new life's rhythm. I waved to Tony at the corner market, smiled at a couple walking their dog, stopped to admire the late autumn flowers still blooming in the planters the city had installed last spring. 2 years ago, scenes like this would have made me feel isolated, broken, like I was watching life happen to other people while mine remained on permanent pause. Now they just looked like life, messy, beautiful, unpredictable life that I was finally participating in fully. At home in my apartment on Teller Avenue, I poured a glass of wine from a local Hudson Valley vineyard and sat on my small balcony. The river sparkled below me, reflecting the lights of Newburgh across the water. I could see the train station where the Metro North carried commuters to and from the city, the hiking trails that wound up into the hills, the bridge that connected this side of the river to possibilities I was still discovering. My phone rang. Michael's name appeared on the screen, and I looked at it for a long moment. 2 years ago, I would have answered immediately, eager to hear his voice even if it brought pain. 6 months ago, I might have answered out of curiosity, wondering what he could possibly have to say. Tonight, I declined the call and blocked his number. Not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. Some conversations are worth having once, but not worth repeating. Some chapters, once closed, should stay that way. The next morning, I woke up to dozens of notifications on my phone. A video from the book signing had gone viral on social media. Someone had recorded the moment when Michael approached me, and while the audio wasn't clear, the body language told its own story. Comments poured in from people sharing their own stories of partners who left during health crises, of finding strength in abandonment, of learning to love themselves enough to walk away from people who couldn't love them completely. You showed that man exactly what he lost, one comment read. But that wasn't quite right. I hadn't shown Michael what he lost. I had shown myself what I had found. And what I had found was worth more than any relationship built on the shaky foundation of conditional love. The book tour continued. Albany, Boston, Burlington, each city bringing new faces and familiar stories. The memoir had touched something universal, the experience of having your life upended, of discovering strength you didn't know you possessed, of learning that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the doorway to the best thing that happens to you. In Burlington, a woman in her 50s approached me after my reading. Her husband had left her after her breast cancer diagnosis, she told me, and she'd spent 3 years convinced she was unlovable, broken, too much trouble for anyone to handle. Your book made me realize, she said, tears in her eyes, that he didn't leave because I got sick. He left because he wasn't capable of the kind of love I deserved. That was it, exactly. The realization that had set me free. 6 months later, I received a wedding invitation in the mail. Michael's name was on it, along with someone called Dr. Jennifer Walsh. The wedding was scheduled for June at a vineyard in the Finger Lakes, a destination wedding for someone who'd always preferred intimate gatherings close to home. I looked at the invitation for exactly 3 seconds before dropping it in the recycling bin. Then I went back to writing my second book, this one about joy, the kind that comes not from having everything work out the way you planned, but from building a life so authentic that it can weather any storm. Because I had learned something that my younger self, the one who would have been devastated by that wedding invitation, could never have understood. You don't need someone to choose you when you've already chosen yourself. And once you truly, deeply choose yourself, you realize that anyone who would walk away during your hardest moments was never really there to begin with. The greatest love story of my life hadn't been the one that ended in a sterile doctor's office. It was the one that began there, right here in Beacon, where I learned that home isn't a person or a place. It's the peace you make with yourself when you finally stop trying to be someone else's idea of who you should be. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that peace becomes so complete that when your past shows up wanting back into your present, you can smile and walk away, knowing that some gifts come disguised as losses. And some endings are actually the most beautiful beginnings you'll ever experience.